I want to get us started here. It's 1 o'clock, and first of all, just want to introduce myself. So I'm Steve Young. I'm the director of the Northeastern IPM Center, and I'm also an adjunct faculty member with Cornell University. And I would like to welcome everyone to the National Forum on Climate and Pests here at the National Academies of Sciences in Washington, D.C. And I would like to thank very much our speakers who are in the room here with us today. And I would also like to thank those of you who are watching online, participating with us. And I would like to encourage you folks to ask questions at any point, and we'll try to answer those as we can. And I anticipate that we're going to have a lot of discussion over the next day and a half. So I'd like to also thank our organizing committee, which includes the Regional Integrated Pest Management Centers. It includes the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences, Cornell Institute for Climate Smart Solutions, the American Society of Agronomy, and the USDA Regional Climate Hubs. And I would also like to thank the USDA National Institute for Food and Agriculture for providing funding for this forum. So I guess I just want to give a little background for in a lot of the reasons why we're here, and just to let you know that this is being done to address two major issues that most of us are familiar with, but climate change is impacting the severity of pest outbreaks, the emergence of new pests, and pest distribution patterns. Research has addressed these areas, but we are only beginning to understand the impacts on the environment, economies, and the society and culture. So growers and land managers have relatively little information to know which practices, current and new, will help them prepare for changes coming, but also that are presently occurring. And so despite the known correlation between climate change and pests, and an increased number of pest reviewed publications, there's really been no single event where researchers and extension, in this case, can first of all learn about the current research being conducted on the effect of climate on pests and host-pest interactions. Number two, understand the consequences of potential shifts in agriculture and forestry related to land use due to climate-related pest outbreaks or reductions. And three, also develop frameworks to support pest management decisions that will lead to more sustainable U.S. agriculture and forest ecosystems in changing climates. So a lot of information there, a lot of background that I think is important that we kind of set the framework for what we're going to do. But this National Forum on Climate and Pests, we basically brought together leading scientists that are working in the area of climate and pests, along with the scientific community, and that is basically our online folks. And we're doing this at the National Academies in Washington, D.C. The experts will share the latest science-based information, and we're also going to strategize ways to plan for adaptable and resilient agricultural forestry ecosystems that are increasingly vulnerable to climate and pests. Will we come up with solutions? Probably not, but we will be able to strategize and think, how do we move forward with this? So this cross-disciplinary forum is composed of research advances related to climate and the three main pest categories: weeds, insects, plant pathogens. There are many other pests, if you will, and we hope to hear about those as well, and their impacts on the fields of agriculture and forestry ecosystems. So the organizations that have put this together are partnering along with the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and we're hoping to foster discussion about current needs, information gaps, and opportunities for increased research, investment, and collaboration. Okay, so I hope that gives everyone some background, and I know probably a lot of you have been involved in reading or learning about that in one way or the other. But I thought what would be good to do now is for us to just go around the room, and I'd like to have everyone introduce themselves. And if you could give your name, organization, title, and area of interest related to pests and/or climate. And I was told that when you are speaking, make sure the button is pushed on your microphone so the folks online can hear as well. So why don't we just go with Andy, if you could go ahead and lead us off on that.
All right, good afternoon, and I'm going to apologize up front here because I'm going to give probably a little bit too long of an introduction, but I'm here representing the Certified Crop Advisor Program, which is a certification arm of the American Society of Agronomy. So the folks that I represent, there's about 13,000 CCAs or agronomists out there in the countryside. Their primary goal is to make recommendations to farmers. So as we think about changes that occur, as we think about trying to make improved recommendations around whether it's pest management or fertility management, these are the folks that really do the job on the ground and making those recommendations to the farmer. So a key link in this. I do work for Monsanto, so that's kind of my side job with the CCA program. At Monsanto, I manage a research team in Illinois and Wisconsin, and we do pre-commercial research for Monsanto for all of our products that we develop. And on that, I do actually manage our field sustainability team. So we have a carbon neutral commitment at Monsanto, and part of my responsibility is to help kind of take that to the field and try and investigate that from an agronomic perspective. So, thanks.
I'm Benjamin Cook. I'm a climate scientist at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and I work primarily on the problem of climate change and drought, trying to understand the processes by which we can expect drought dynamics to change as we move into a warmer world.
Nathan Mueller. I'm a postdoc fellow at Harvard University, and I'm really interested in all of the connections between agriculture and climate, both how climate change influences crop productivity, but also how changes in agricultural land use affect the climate.
Hello, my name is Carrie Brown Lima from the New York Invasive Species Research Institute based at Cornell. And my interest is really to understand more what land managers can expect in terms of invasive species so they can incorporate that knowledge with what's going to happen with invasive species in terms of climate change so they can incorporate that knowledge into their management plans.
I'm Mike Hoffman, Executive Director of the Cornell Institute for Climate Smart Solutions. I'm also an entomologist. It's a logical combination of pest management and interest in climate change. The goal of our institute is, in fact, to help farmers adapt and mitigate their impact on the climate.
I'm Matt Ayres. It's nice to be here. I'm a professor of biological sciences at Dartmouth. I'm also an entomologist and ecologist. I study effects of climate and other things on the population dynamics and abundance of insects that eat trees, especially ones that sometimes kill trees.
Good afternoon. My name's Elizabeth Blood. I'm a program officer at the National Science Foundation in the Directorate of Biological Sciences. I oversee two funding programs that are related to this topic, primarily in the area of ecology and climate change and land use change. One of them is called Ecosystem Studies. The other is called Macrosystems Biology. And macrosystems biology is studying the biosphere at regional to continental scales. And both of these programs have a significant climate change component to them.
My name is Mark Gleason. I'm a plant pathologist at Iowa State University, and my interest is looking at the intersection of climate and weather and how those things influence growers' production decision making.
Good afternoon. My name is Robin Shane, and I am here at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I'm the director of the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources. We've looked at a number of pests and pathogens at the requests of, for example, the state of California and the state of Florida, and also USDA from time to time, but we've not at all gotten into the area of climate change. We have a sister board that's done a lot of work on climate change called the Board on Atmospheric Science and Climate, but hasn't done any work related to the pests of managed ecosystems. So I'm here today to listen to all of you and get your wisdom.
I'm Denisha Seth Carley. I'm the director at the Southern IPM Center and also an assistant professor at NC State University. We look at how climate change influences drought stress and heat tolerance in ornamental plants in the urban landscape.
And I'm Lene Jess. I'm the co-director of the North Central IPM Center at Michigan State University. So we're interested in, obviously, how climate change and pests affect our IPM programs that growers are using.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ken Linthicum. I'm the Center Director at the USDA Ayres Center for Medical, Agricultural, and Veterinary Entomology in Gainesville, Florida. Our center is very much involved in impacts of climate on various insect pests, and my particular research as an entomologist is related to how climate impacts diseases transmitted by insects to animals and to people. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Herb Bolton, National Program Leader for Entomology at the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. I'm the team lead for the Crop Protection and Pest Management Program. It's a competitive funding program which deals with integrated pest management, and of course those integrated pest management systems are being greatly impacted by climate change.
My name is Jim Stack. I'm at Kansas State University. On the research side, we look at emergence and the redistribution of pathogens. But I'm also with the National Plant Diagnostic Network, and of course our concern is early detection and accurate diagnostics.
Hi, I'm Nancy Cavallero. I work at the National Institute of Food and Agriculture along with Herb, and I'm in the Institute of Bioenergy, Climate, and Environment, so I'm in the climate division, but I'm a soil and water and ecosystems person. I run programs on carbon cycle science and climate and agriculture.
I'm Jean Steiner. I work for Agricultural Research Service as the director of the Grazing Lands Research Laboratory in Oklahoma, and I lead an integrated team in kind of diversified crop livestock systems, and I also participated in this process representing American Society of Agronomy on the planning team.
Hi, I'm Scott Izard, professor of aerobiology at Penn State University. In the meteorology department and plant pathology departments. I'm also the project director on a NIFA-funded CAP, in which our mission is to engage stakeholders, growers, and their consultants to share data on pests so that we can, in part, so that we can help with IPM issues, but also for research, climate change research or long-term research.
I'm Steve Frank. I'm at North Carolina State University, and my lab works on pests that kill trees, and particularly how urban warming and the urban environment affects pest populations and tree health, and we try and extrapolate those findings to predict the effects of climate change.
Walt Mahaffey with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Corvallis, Oregon. My group works on improving decision support systems for perennial crops, and we do everything from inoculum monitoring to scaling weather, climate data, and developing biophysical models for crop simulation.
My name is Barbara Bentz, and I'm a scientist with the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, and I'm also an adjunct at Utah State University. And my research is focused on forest insects that kill trees, most notably bark beetles, and how temperature influences these insects. And then, so we collect data and develop mechanistic models for predicting how climate change is going to influence these populations. The national forest systems now, by law, have to incorporate climate change into any of their national forest management plans. And so we're using these models to help understand which forests might be more vulnerable than others.
Hi, I'm Jeff Dukes. I'm the director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and I'm interested in ecosystem responses to climate change and other environmental changes. Also interested in invasive species, what makes a species invasive, what makes an ecosystem susceptible to them, and then I've been interested in a long time in the intersection between climate change and invasive species. Most of my work's on plants.
Hi, I'm Keith Dixon. I'm from climate scientist at NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory located in Princeton, New Jersey. For most of my career, I was one of those people who contributed to building, running, and analyzing global climate models. In recent years, I've also been involved with trying to explore some of the topics about how information produced by those global climate models is transferred and translated for use in the impacts community.
Hi, my name is Jeff Hickey. I'm an associate professor at the University of Idaho. I'm interested in forest insects of the western U.S. and especially bark beetles and how climate change is affecting their outbreaks.
Okay, I'm John Genshu. I'm a staff scientist at Los Alamos National Lab, and my main interest is looking into understanding the mechanism of tree mortality, especially under the stress, either drought or heat waves, and how they interact with the insects. And we would like to represent those key components into the Earth's model so that we can better predict the future climate.
Hi, I'm Karen Garrett at the University of Florida. So I work in the plant pathology department, the new Institute for Sustainable Food Systems, and the Emerging Pathogens Institute. My lab focuses on systems modeling to understand how to improve plant health management.
Are you sure we haven't gone around alphabetically? No. My name is Lou Ziska. I'm a plant physiologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Beltsville, Maryland. I work on trying to understand the impact of climate change and rising CO2 levels on crops and weeds in both managed systems in agriculture, but also in natural systems. And as part of that, I also do work looking at the intersection between climate, weed biology, and public health, which spans everything from understanding the role of climate and CO2 on the levels of artemisinin and Artemisia annua, which is a weed used for in anti-malarial experiments, but also looking at how weeds can serve as a unique source of genes for crops to begin to adapt to global climate change.
Hello, I'm Nancy Cusimano. I'm the event manager of the Forum on Climate and Pests, and I have a couple of more mundane things to talk about. First off, if you have a PowerPoint presentation, either this afternoon or tomorrow, and you'd like to load it onto the room laptop, we can do that. Just let me know. Restrooms are left and left. And lastly, I will be monitoring the chat. So if I get questions for any of you specifically, I will be letting you know about that.
Great, thank you, Nancy, and thanks to everyone else. I think from what you've heard, there's obviously a diverse group here, and you know, not only do Lou and I have a relationship because of our last names being near the end of the alphabet, but we also work on weeds, and I have a interest in the weeds and that realm as far as how those plants are responding to extreme events, particularly drought. That has really piqued my interest. I was in Nebraska for a while, and I had experienced the severe drought of 2012, and I saw some very interesting things happening in the field related to, in this case, weeds, and I think that has been something that's stayed with me and even has kind of led to this forum in a way where, you know, the climate is now impacting pests in ways that we haven't seen before, and I think this is a great opportunity for us who represent different groups out there, whether they're climate, whether it's the pest side, to really have an engaging discussion, and that's my hope. That's, I think, the committee's hope. for this time together is to really talk about things. So as you look at the agenda, as we go through the next day and a half, there's some structure there, but a lot of it is for discussion. So as much as we can do that, I would encourage people to ask questions, to make comments, to interrupt people if that's appropriate, and to keep the dialogue going. So I know that we've got a slate of speakers this afternoon, and so I want to get to that and to give them enough time to get us started here, and we're going to hear from several individuals, but I will just turn it over to our first speaker, which is going to be Keith Dixon, and you've got a presentation loaded.
It's loaded up.
Okay. So.
Tell me all the other logistics. And so I stand here.
You can stand there.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I control. So we'll see how well I do.
So you want to put this in slideshow, yeah?
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me here. I had the danger or the pleasure of being the first speaker before I get a good read for the room. I thought I'd open up by just giving some perspectives from what I'll call the upstream part of the topics that are going to be discussed here, right? So as we saw during the introductions, I'm kind of from that global scale, large scale, multi-decadal physical climate community, and there's maybe a couple others who are in there. And I think that if this forum is going on, it's because the topic of climate change is on everyone's radar screen, and the reason it got on everyone's radar screen is because it started with the idea that there was some solid, credible scientific information going on up at the level that I inhabit, and now we have this question about how that information gets transferred and translated so it becomes of use for you folks. So here's how I would just present it from my perspective. You would probably draw this little bubble diagram about how information exchanged differently than me, but I want to start with this idea that we have the large-scale, compelling, consistent storylines that have emerged over the years about how the global climate is changing. Now, I'll be talking a lot about global climate models, but the truth is that we can use the metaphor of the sturdy three-legged stool, that information that's gotten it on your personal radar screen about climate change comes from a combination of climate observations being analyzed, global climate model output, and it all being consistent with what our basic scientific understanding about how things work together. So it's not a house of cards built upon one bit of evidence here or there. It's when we get this consistent story that comes across. Now, this is in the realm of looking at large-scale issues in these climate models, but what does that do other than put it perhaps on yours and a lot of other folks' radar screens that you're now interested how pests can be affected by that? We can get similar questions from a whole bunch of different folks interested in adaptation or climate impacts, and here's how I would have the rest of the diagram kind of go. So if we're interested in projections of how the climate can change over the next 30, 50, 100 years, that's going to come from global climate models in large part. And then that information often needs to be translated and scaled in order to get it into a form that's of use to folks like you who are interested in how it's related to pests or the various things that folks can be interested in. So from the introductions, I gather that most of the people here, I would probably say, inhabit the lower right-hand side model, climate impacts analyses, that general agreement on that, while I and a couple others in the upper left-hand corner. So we have to have this flow of information exchange, and then ultimately the information flows over in order to enable decision support, right? So we have to communicate. So there's different communication levels that have to go between different scientific disciplines, and then also to a wider community. So if that's our starting point, I inhabit the area up here for most of my career, which I get to feel old by saying it started at GFDL when Reagan was president. And in the past couple of years, I've been involved in a little bit more in this next step about how we can translate and transfer that information so it's scientifically credible as it gets used in impacts analyses. Again, what got things on people's radar screens? I would say there's three main questions from the physical climate that helped do that. If we think back to the 2007 IPCC report, it's a milestone for many folks who look back at that. First is the planet's climate changing in significant ways. We'll call that an issue of detection. That's where we're going to rely a lot on observational records. But then secondly, it's, well, so what? If it is, can we say why it's happening? Is it due to what people are doing? Is it natural variation, or both? That's part of attribution science. So that's going to involve a lot of observations as well as a lot of global climate models where we do a bunch of what-if scenarios. We treat them as our virtual Earths, put things in and out. How does the planet respond if greenhouse gas levels were held constant, if there were no volcanoes? Do those different experiments, tweak out the differences, and we can come up with the answers there. Well, if we go back to the 2007 report for that first issue on detection, the statement there was that it was unequivocal that the global climate was changing. For the second point, it was that most of the warming that was occurring in the planet over the past 50 years can be directly attributed to human activities. And then the third issue we get to is projections. Okay, now it's on our radar screen. What's going to happen in the coming century? Well, now we have to rely largely on the global climate models. We do not have observations of the future, and that's where we're at. But even the output of those global climate models is not necessarily going to be in the form that's going to be best suited to inform the impacts community, whether it's pest or infrastructure, human health, water resources, or whatever. So the dashed line is talking about that one of those translation steps from the realm of the physical climate community to others. So many folks have seen this sort of figure before. Just give me an idea. Some global average temperature. Okay. So we'll just talk a little bit just to frame the question about, as we go to translate and transfer the information, what sort of uncertainties are on it. One of the common questions we get from various impacts communities is, can you just tell me what the best climate model is in the most likely scenario so I can have a data set to use for my impacts analyses for the future? I'm used to using observations. I just want to plug in observations of the future instead. So instead we have to start talking about the uncertainties, why we don't have that one single answer. So on this figure, we're looking at global average temperature as a function of time. We look on the right-hand side of the plot, we can see 4 different colors for different what-if scenarios, different amounts of greenhouse gases and other radiative forcing agents over time. So that's an issue where there's an uncertainty in how the climate will respond in the future that really has very little to do with climate science. That's an issue of what people will do, what the emissions rates will be, what the economy will do, what energy sources there are, what treaties are made. So we can have a range there if we look at some of those center lines of the different colors, from scenarios that might warm a degree over the century to one of 4 degrees centigrade over the century, or about 7 degrees Fahrenheit. So a wide range depending upon what people will do. Now, around each of those darker lines, there's some shaded areas, a range, an envelope of possibilities. So that's where if you take one of those scenarios about how emissions will change and plug that into a bunch of these different global climate models, 20 or 30 of them around the world, they're each going to give somewhat different answers. So that's kind of the envelope or the range of the results you'll get, because some of those models will respond a little differently. Some will have stronger feedback. Some will have an ocean that'll either slow down the response or not. So that would be considered the physical uncertainty. So we have a couple different sources of uncertainty and an envelope of possibilities. And what's not shown in that figure, because that figure I showed you before was just when we take those 20 or 30 models and we average them all together. We get nice, smooth lines, which is very nice for executive summaries, but hides a bit of information that can come back and bite us, is that that's actually more like what the original data look like. So even if we're averaging over the whole globe, you're still going to see the ups and downs, the bumps from El Niños come and go and other things. So there's always going to be variability in the system. So what we're seeing is trends superimposed upon the natural variability of the system. And this is just a figure I put in there to remind me that what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these global climate models are big, complex physics-based models that run on supercomputers for a long time, that include components of the atmosphere, the ocean, the land surface, sea ice, and all that. They're physics-based, Their grid boxes are large enough that they have to include some subgrid scale statistical type parameterizations, but we start equals F equals ma, the equations of motions for fluid on a rotating sphere, and take it from there. I think the model I've been working with most recently divides the globe up into about 75 or so million boxes with all the physics equations at each. Now, if we go back to that diagram with all the little wiggles, the spaghetti diagram, I want to think about the uncertainties in a different way. Here's one way to think about for your application. If you want to think about what time scale you're interested in, then where the uncertainties are and how large they are, there's different sources of uncertainty. That orange type center line going through there talks about that internal variability that continues, right? El Niños are going to come and go. Solar cycle exists. There's going to be the ups and downs that are natural. And the vertical extent there gives you an idea in temperature space on a global average, how much variation you would expect from that. The blue area then gives you an idea about the breadth or the difference about what uncertainties or range of results you can get if you take a given emission scenario and consider it for different global climate models, that each one's going to have a somewhat different response. So you can see that that envelope tends to increase over time. The farther we go out, the more the difference from model to model will become noticeable. But the green area, the largest one, the biggest breadth, gives us an idea about what that scenario difference is. That's the what will people do part. What will the greenhouse gas emissions be over time? So we have these different sources of uncertainty. Some fit in the science realm, some more in the social science realm. And then I'll just finish up this part by just talking about that the uncertainty when you think about your application. When people ask, well, how uncertain are the information, I'll come back and say, well, what time scale are you interested in? How long a projection? Because what the relative uncertainties are going to differ about whether you're interested in the next 20 years or the next 100 years. Also, the spatial scale matters. What I was showing in those previous plots were global averages. You average a lot of things out, you get smoother lines like that. Here you see the two insets that are, again, are showing a measure of that spread or the variability. One for the one on the left, this is global, that's looking at global means, surface air temperatures. You can then look at the one next to it that's showing the North American, still a large area average, and you can notice how the uncertainty is greater. If you were to make a similar plot for a given state, a given location, the uncertainties are going to go up. The spread of results depending upon which model and scenario you look at. The time averaging length also matters. Are you interested in what's happening on individual days, individual years? Are you interested in how decadal mean temperatures, for example, are going to change? So your application and the need for it also have an influence on how uncertain the results are for your application, and also the variable of interest. Here I just showed temperature plots. If you were looking at precipitation, you would get some different variability characteristics. Okay, so that's just a summary of what I just talked about here. Okay, so now we'll talk about a little bit about how, if you look through the literature, there's one way, a common way, not the only way, what I'll call a top-down approach to try to go from large-scale climate to local scale impacts and applications. You can start with the idea of the emission scenarios, that how CO2 and other radiative active gases will change in the future. That information is taken and used as input into the global climate models. Physics-based, they're not using observations, the models otherwise. They're then going to respond to that and produce climates of the future. So that would be the global climate model output. Now, that output, which has its own uncertainties, is often going to be viewed as not as suitable for direct use as impacts models. It's going to have biases. If that global climate model for the area you're interested in is 1.5 degrees too warm and maybe 20% too high or too low in its annual precipitation, that's not going to be viewed as terrible from the global climate modeling perspective. Remember, we're modeling everything from the surface of the atmosphere up to the top of the atmosphere, down through the depths of the ocean, the poles, the equator, and everything in between. So the models aren't going to be perfect everywhere, maybe not even anywhere. So the those outputs may not be ready for your impacts model. So often then there's going to be a refinement step, a kind of a downscaling as it's often called. I'll refer to both statistical and dynamical downscaling. If there's interest, we can talk about that more later, but we can think of it as a refinement step where the output of global climate models is looked to have value added to it. There are going to be attempts that are, one, going to try to address the global climate model biases, so that by comparing the model observations, we can maybe figure out what its biases are. But also there's a matter of spatial resolution. Those global climate models that run for such a long time may have grid box resolution of 100 kilometers or 60 kilometers or something like that. That's not going to be suitable. You may be used to working with observations at 4 kilometers or 800 meters. So there's going to be a downscaling process to try to give you that higher spatial resolution and to address some of those biases. And that's what usually gets used in the impacts models in that top-down approach. Now, I just showed one flow through there, but actually, if you look through the literature, what often happens is the folks in my community, in the coupled model intercomparison project, often take at the different modeling centers our different global climate models and run a standardized set of experiments with different emission scenarios and then put terabytes of data out on data servers where people can go right-click, download, and run with them. So we can then sample the uncertainty that way. You can sample different emission scenarios, different GCM output. But again, as I look through the impacts literature, a common approach for the top-down method is then those different, whatever set, maybe we'll look at 3 different emission scenarios and 5 different global climate model output, that information tends to get piped through one downscaling method more often than not and then put into impacts models. So what's lost there, if you pick one downscaling method, you're assuming that that value added is so good that you're not introducing large uncertainties in it, or at least those aren't being acknowledged. And that's something to be aware of. Here's a slide. Sorry, it's not the best. I threw it together a couple hours before I got on the train to come down here. But I wanted to kind of illustrate, instead of just throwing words, this idea that the statistical downscaling methods can make a difference. Let's say you have an application that is sensitive to the number of days in a year where the temperatures go above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, here's 2 results for Florida for the count of the number of days that are above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for a high greenhouse gas emission scenario at the end of the 21st century, one that probably had about 7 degrees of warming in it. And we can see 2 pretty different answers. One, down there on the left, you can see a little bit west of Miami, there's a place where there's almost 70 days of year of days above 100, so that'd be 10 weeks. And the one on the right, it's a little bit less than 15, so maybe about 2 weeks. So pretty big differences, but it was produced from the same greenhouse gas emission scenario and actually from the output from the same exact global climate model. The only difference here was the different statistical downscaling method that was used. Now, this is not the usual case. I'm using this as a poster child, but these sort of sensitivities might exist in your data if you just right-click download the downscale data. By the way, we performed this experiment that I'm showing the results in, something we call a perfect model framework, so we actually have a truth for the future, and in that case you can see that it's probably the one on the right that's a little better, and the one on the left is suspect. But there are data sets you can go to data servers and download things that produced by methods that have a lot more in common with the one on the left than the one on the right, and so be aware. So I talked so far about a lot of the uncertainties involved there. How about instead I now circle back a little bit and start on the large scale about some things where there's some agreement instead of just talking about the uncertainties. Here's a plot of, if we've taken from the IPCC report, we're looking at global patterns of annual average surface air temperature. So if we look across a couple dozen global climate models, average them together, look at the end of the 21st century, and we're just looking at the pattern, the scaling factors, as you see the somewhat unusual units, degrees C per degree C of global mean change. So a value of 1 means that those places warm just about the same as the global average. And we can see very, very consistent, robust results. The continents are going to warm more quickly than over the ocean. The Arctic is going to warm roughly about twice as warm as the global average. Places that are going to warm slowest amount will probably be over places of the ocean that have a lot of deep mixing, such as up in the North Atlantic and down around Antarctica. For the US, I think basically if you look at that plot, you can figure you can probably take the global average and multiply somewhere in the 1.25 to maybe 1.5 range, right? We're over a continent, it's going to warm a little bit more than the global average. And those little dots are just showing where there tends to be general agreement among the different global climate models. Now, not all that useful for your applications, but it's kind of starting at the large scale. For precipitation, probably the second most studied variable, you'll notice, first of all, there's not as many dots. There's not quite as much agreement from model to model. But we see a pattern here that emerges that sometimes in shorthand we say the wet get wetter and the dry get drier. The colors off on the right-hand color of the part of the color bar would show where for each degree of warming there's maybe as much as a 12% increase in annual average precipitation. You can see that in some equatorial areas and up again in the Arctic and a little bit in the Antarctic as well. So these are areas where there tends to be moisture convergence now. You tend to have a decent amount of precipitation relative to surrounding areas, and with a more vigorous atmospheric circulation like we can expect with greenhouse warming, those areas get more energetic, larger annual precipitation levels. If you look over places like Australia and elsewhere, you can see some places that are dry now. They're underneath these subtropical high zones where there tends to be descending warm air dominates, and those areas can actually have decreases in precipitation. Bad enough on its own, but you consider it's occurring in a framework with rising temperatures. That means drought can be an issue even more. There's also more subtle things. There's a little bit of a shift poleward of these bands. If you look over the US, it's not an area, the continental US, where there's a really strong signal. You can actually see kind of the zero line goes through the US with a little division between the north and the south. And this slide I just put in here because it's something that none of you are probably interested in, but you're influenced by. And it can tell you why, when you get to the point you say, why don't you global climate modelers just spend a lot more time improving blank, 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 whatever matters to you? Well, part of it is you might be surprised, we probably spend about half of our computer time in the global climate models on the ocean. Why? Because the ocean has a huge heat capacity. It affects the patterns of change and the rates of change because it's constantly interacting with the atmosphere. So this figure taken from numbers in the most recent IPCC report just summarize that. If we look over the past 40 years or so, more than 90% of the heat that's been gained by this warming planet resides in the ocean. So the ocean is really the big dog in this, and the atmosphere, the one part we care about, is kind of the twitchy dog's tail. Okay, going down the next level in spatial resolution, one can go to something like the National Climate Assessment. If you just take some of their 12 key findings, you can take a little deeper dive in that document in Chapter 2, relating with the physical climate science. I'm not going to read all these, but you get the idea, and you're probably familiar with the idea that you can start getting into a little bit more finer level of detail before, where you can have these assessment reports that are going to look at the individual studies, the individual models, and start looking for the robust results that hold up. So, in addition to something that's probably pretty obvious, that across the US the growing season was going to increase, you can see some things there where, according to that assessment, they feel that there'll be more winter and spring precipitation in the northern US, less in the southwest, etc. Droughts in the southwest and heat waves everywhere become more intense, cold waves less intense. Okay, so that's kind of the next level. Now again, you might be saying this is all well and good, but this is too broad brush. The concerns I have, the pests I'm interested in, have different requirements than that. How do we get to that next level? Okay, so that's where we're then going to come up with a set of challenges. And what I'm going to just frame it here is that in trying to go with the scientifically credible information that's going to be consistent with the state of the science at the large scale, and then getting it down to the application level, we need to think about the different bridges we need to build. And I think that's what this forum is about. So from my perspective, one is that we start with these global climate models that produce the projections. And where's their strength? What's their interest? It's the large spatial scales. And they've been built with a climate research focus. They're not prediction tools. They're being repurposed in order to provide information for applications. They primarily have been built to help us understand the climate system and its workings better. So we need to go from that large-scale climate research focus to the smaller scale application focus of people like the folks we have assembled around the table today. Another step of that is that we need to refine that GCM output. every global climate model, every generation of global climate models has been shown to improve its simulation of the contemporary climate. We get better, we get higher spatial resolution, we get smarter at how we build them, they become more sophisticated, but they're still imperfect. They're models, so they need that sort of refinement. And often that gets done by downscaling. But one thing, especially in the US, that hasn't been given as much attention as looking at the global climate models is evaluating the downscaling and the strengths and limitations. Just taking one off the shelf, just doing right-click download, it's value added, that's it, that may or may not be the best way to go. And the last step I'll just say is that a lot of times at meetings similar to this for other impacts groups, we start with talking about how we're going to try to exchange ideas and that, but often when people leave, then it comes down to, can you tell me where the best data is? We've gotten really good at transferring data. We put data sets on servers, we build nice GUI interfaces or other ways to get the data from place to place, but are we also transferring the knowledge about those methods on how to use it well? That's the question. Is there guidance? Are there caveats? Do we know about the uncertainty so that there's wise use made of those data sets? And to me, that brings up a little bit of the question of ownership. Who owns? Who needs to build that bridge and maintain it? And part of that has to do with what I think the role of the different kind of boundary organizations that are out there. And by boundary organizations, I'm talking about things like the climate hubs or the USGS climate science centers, NOAA RESAs, et cetera, et cetera. You can come up with other examples, but those, don't use the hand motions, those go-betweens that are looking to bridge the community between the large-scale physical science and the applications. And I'll kind of end with these two quotes in here. One from, since we're in this building, why not a National Research Council report that noted that addressing the wide spectrum of user climate information needs is outpacing the limited capacity of people within the climate modeling community. In other words, when we got back to those three main questions, yes, it's unequivocal the climate's changing, yes, it's mostly due to human activity, and yeah, there's more of it in the future, that created a demand on the climate science that maybe the climate scientists themselves, the modelers, those upstream folks, just aren't in a position in terms of their skills and their numbers in order to meet. So maybe we need to build up some of these boundary organizations to help transfer that information. And also from a paper where I was like nth co-author down there, but Joe Barsugli, the lead author, is that we believe, and I'll state this, that the dilemma now for folks that are looking to use climate projections for applications is often not finding the climate predictions or projections. We can find them on a lot of servers, but instead the bigger challenge is probably how to use them, pick the right one, assess its credibility for your application, and use it wisely. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Keith. So I have a couple of questions, and again, if folks have questions, feel free to jump in. We've got time for it. You know, the thing that I think kind of struck me was that you talked about, you know, what will people do, and how does that affect a lot of what we're seeing, and I guess, you know, one of the things is how much has that been teased out, you know, the anthropogenic effect versus just the natural effect in how it's affecting climate, and is that been looked at? And maybe I'm speaking ignorantly here, but
okay, so on the question that rephrase your question is looking backward, what's happened already, when this idea of how can we say that most of the warming or most of some observed change is attributed to human activity or not, that gets put under this banner that's called in the literature the detection and attribution research. So the general way, broad brush way that it's approached is that if you have high quality observations, one can then take hopefully high quality models, our virtual Earths, and we then run those models in different configurations. So I can start back in 1850 and run a model, because it's my virtual world, where I can hold greenhouse gas levels constant and only allow the natural forcings to change. Changes in volcanoes, changes in the solar cycle, and see what kind of response my climate model has. Then I can run a case where I forget the volcanoes, forget the solar cycle, only include the greenhouse gases. I can do one where I include greenhouse gases and sulfate aerosols or soot. There's a large number of different radiative forcing agents, those things that cause energy to flow through the atmosphere differently and spur different feedbacks. And we can run a suite of these experiments, and it can be done by a number of different modeling groups on there. And then you can look through and see how those modeled results are or are not consistent with what was observed. And that's where, if we look by just the last 3, 4 or so decades, is where you really get to the point where we cannot, with the models of today, explain what's been observed by those natural variations alone. The curves just split. That the warming that was seen, you wouldn't see from the natural forcings alone. It would be pretty level, or actually probably even down just a little bit if it was from the natural forcings alone. And we don't just look at temperatures or just surface air temperatures. One could also look at the vertical profile. Sometimes you'll hear, hey, couldn't it just be the sun? Maybe it's not measured well. If it was a solar thing, then we would see a more uniform warming throughout the vertical aspect of took a cross-section through the atmosphere. But instead, we see a pattern that's consistent with the greenhouse warming signal, where you see the warming at the surface, and then the lower stratosphere, you can actually get a little bit of cooling. So there's a number of methods that can go through it. You end up using the observations, the models, and some statistics in order to tease out and try to come up with those attribution statements. As far as going forward in the what will people do, as climate modelers, we try to stay out of the question about which one of those future scenarios is more realistic than the other. Right. Some people might want to call the high one business as usual. Others might, they're going to have different views. I just kind of sit back and say, what are we? We're in 2016. Let's go back 50 years ago. So in 1966. Today, the largest emitter of CO2 is China. In 66, I think China was in the midst of the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong. So I don't know. If we go back to the estimations being made by the economists or demographers of that time, about 50 years from today, I don't know how many decided that China would have taken the path it took and the US would have taken. So I think it's kind of beyond me to try to speculate 50 years from now which one of those curves is more realistic or another. So from the climate modeling standpoint, we take the ones that we are given, and then we run with those, and you consider those marker scenarios or whatever.
Right.
So that's the way I approach it.
Okay, good. Anyone else have any questions? Or yeah, go ahead.
With the climate modeling, how do they all deal with orographic effects? Because over the ocean, you don't really deal with that.
Right. So these are physical-based models. We take the globe, chop it up into a bunch of three-dimensional grid boxes. We represent over land the orography as best we can given that model's spatial resolution. Same thing in the ocean. We have the bathymetry. We're not just dealing with the surface. We go down below 5 kilometers. And then the question of how we deal with it, it's there, and then the model's physics take over. So we don't plug in things. The things that we specify is the orography. Depending upon what the model is, you might plug in what the land surface is like, what vegetation it has, what the soil holding capacity is. In some models today, you don't even specify what the vegetation is. The model can actually, in these Earth system models, generate its own vegetation type. But as far as the orography, then the physics of the model are going to take over. And what we have seen is that's one of the aspects of the global climate models that does improve in a brute force approach. If we get bigger supercomputers, more compute time, you can make those grid boxes smaller. You get higher resolution, you get more peaked Rocky Mountains instead of kind of a smooth version, and then we can see things like the rain shadow in the US get better. But the models aren't all there yet, and there's still room for improvement. So short answer is how it handled is going to be through the model physics that are there, both the continuous equations as they get discretized and also whatever the subgrid scale parameterizations are.
So it's still planar within the grid cell. It's still pretty much two-dimensional within the grid cell.
Use the mic.
So it's still really relatively two-dimensional within the grid cell.
Some of the subgrid scale parameterizations now, I think some of the people who develop it would say, yeah, not as much. It's moving away from that. So each of the different components of the models are all getting more sophisticated as time goes on. It's not just the brute force of the additional resolution. That helps a lot. But all the components are also getting more sophisticated, more detailed. There's fewer things being prescribed or set, and more things are trying to be put in that are physically based. And that can actually produce a little bit of attention, because a lot of the impacts community can say, isn't your main goal to produce models that reduce the uncertainties, that kind of drive to some convergence? But for trying to understand the whys and how things work, we're also introducing more degrees of freedom. Every time you add a new feature, a new feedback mechanism that the model's predicting, that's a prognostic case, you have chances for the models to go off in their own little way. So we don't necessarily, with that added sophistication, always reduce the uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Yeah, I was wondering what your advice is to biologists who start looking for GIS data layers. Like, where do they?
What's GIS? Okay, so that was a little sarcastic. I'm from New Jersey. Sorry, but I'm just saying that to probably inadvertently. You've just presented one of the divides or one of the bridges that we have to gap. So in my community, we play with NetCDF, following CF standards with all the metadata and all that. That's what we know. In my laboratory, the 100 scientists, the first ability we had to use ArcGIS was like a year and a half ago. We have one Windows machine sitting in the back in a building with more than 100 people, right? So it's just not our data ecosystem. So if you're looking for your applications, I understand, layers that would make things easy to work in, that's where the partnering needs to occur. Is it the boundary organizations? If that demand exists, who meets it? It's not clear where that bridge goes. I mean, I've been in meetings not exactly on this topic, but similar ones where the fingers can sometimes point. The impacts community can say, look, you're producing this information, but it's not in a form we can use. It's incumbent upon you to produce it in a form we can use. Folks over on the climate modeling side can say, do you know what we're doing already? Like, we don't have the ability to do that. We've met you this far, so it's deciding where the halfway is. And that's where maybe the boundary organizations or the other places to come in and figure out how to do that better, right? If we all had infinite budgets, everybody would be grabbing it and taking it, because then their portfolio would get larger. And the reality is that sometimes we have to figure out where on the bridge we meet.
So a couple of things have come to mind, and I keep changing my question as I listen.
It's okay, I'll change my answer.
We talk about people and their decisions and how that impacts what's going to happen. But there's also plants and animals and the whole biology of the system. And some of that is represented to some extent in these physical models, but a lot of it's not taken into account. How to fit that together in the interactions. And then so that's not really a question, it's just sort of a comment, I guess. But also thinking about the biological systems, be they people or whatever, and what kind of feedbacks and what kind of effects we are concerned about and impacts. Different systems are sensitive to different changes that are happening. And so it's not just global surface average temperature, because it might not matter what the high is during the day, it's the low at nighttime, or the humidity level, it just got to cross this threshold for this pest to just take off. Or if the low never gets down to a certain temperature at night, then those bark beetles are going to be, in control or out of control. So, part of the downscaling is not just spatial; it's temporal, and then there are all these other sort of aspects that we don't hear reported from these global models, and I don't know if they're in there or can they be teased out.
Okay, so tell me how I do on this.
Yeah,
I'm going to break that up
really
into
hard.
2 questions. Now, if I could remember what the 2 were, I'd be doing better. No. So the first one has to do with what's included in the global climate models and not. You mentioned that some of the models include more than others. And broadly speaking, there are still some models that are physics only, right? Back when I started in it was physics only. We just, physics, nothing but physics, that's what we could do. And if we want to run the really higher resolution models, that's what we're going to continue to do, physics only models. However, when we start getting interested in the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and other feedbacks, including the biosphere on land, in the ocean, then we have things that tend to get called Earth system models, where we start having simplified versions of land surface, things going on in the ocean, whatever, both to get the carbon cycle better and to perhaps allow some additional feedbacks and do better. But those models will tend to be coarser spatial resolution because we're spending more compute time with all those additional equations to do that. So that's kind of the starting point on that. So why not even more things are included in the Earth system models ends up being a battle that goes on in a lot of places. Because every time we add something new, how well vetted is it? It's introducing new feedbacks. Is it constrained well? How does it affect everything else? But now we can, on the plus side, we can simulate more things and have more feedbacks. On the question of the downscaling role for different applications that might have more stringent threshold-based critical values. So the global climate models are producing a lot of the predictive data, so if you can trace it back to temperature and humidity and wind speed and all those physical attributes, they're all being produced within the model. The question is, how much of them are being saved out and archived? Because we have limits, right? We can't save something out if you need hourly data, we physically can't. So I'll go a little computer geek right here. The data archive we have, the building we have at GFDL with its 75 or so scientists that archives data, its size right now I think is 87 petabytes. We once had a vendor come in and say, I think you might be the largest non-classified data single site. Google has more stuff in different places than that. So we have a lot of data, but we can't store out everything because we run so many models. So sometimes when you say, here's this variable I would like, is it available? The answer is no, because it wasn't saved out. It's a triage type thing. But if you're interested in the thresholds, that's where the models are going to have some biases, and then the downscaling, if done well, ought to. And we can evaluate that, get you closer so you can do better at days above 100, or like I was looking at something in the brochure, the accumulated growing degree days that accumulated before the last day below 25 degrees Fahrenheit, right? The freeze after an early spring type thing. Those numbers are all there in the model. Whether they're credible or good enough would be an assessment. Is the model doing well enough that you want to use that part of it for your applications research, both from the raw model and then after downscaling. So it ends up being more of a research project than you might want from just going out to a server and downloading the data.
So I'm going to jump in here and just say that I think we're going to address that by others in this room as we go along. So I think other people are going to actually address that question. So that'll be exciting to hear. But I want to move along, so I really appreciate your presentation, Keith, and getting us going here. And now we're going to hear from Nathan Mueller, and he's going to talk about some of the stuff that he's been doing in agricultural context. So Nathan, if you want to come up and get.
All right. Great. Thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. So hopefully I'll provide a bit of a bridge from that last talk. So still thinking about changes in climate, but now getting down to thinking about the land surface and its contribution to climate as well. So specifically, I want to talk about agricultural land use change and regional climate. And often when we think about land use change influencing climate, we're thinking about it from a biogeochemical perspective, clearing land, releasing carbon, so on and so forth. But these changes also have a direct biophysical influence on the climate, and that can be really important in these areas where land use is very dynamic. So just as a schematic for the types of processes that I'm going to be thinking about here, this is a cartoon showing a deforestation scenario. So on the left, we have, a dense canopy of trees, roots going down, accessing soil moisture. We have energy coming into the system. Some of that's getting reflected, but it's a relatively dark surface, so it's not a huge amount. But because we have all of these leaves and highly productive vegetation and roots accessing deeper soil moisture, we're using a lot of energy to evaporate water, either from the soil surface or from the leaves through transpiration. And that means that there's less energy heating up the land surface and also the air. So you end up with a lower surface temperature right there. Now, let's say we deforest this landscape. Well, the reflectivity might be a little higher. That's the albedo. But we're also going to have much less energy being used for evapotranspiration and a higher surface temperature as a result. So I'm not talking about tropical deforestation, I'm thinking about agricultural landscapes, but this sort of binary schematic gives you a nice view of the processes. Okay, so specifically I want to hit upon 3 different studies, the results of 3 different studies, and then close by commenting on why I think this is important for considering for our discussion here. So we're going to start off with kind of a quote-unquote local scale study looking at recent cropland expansion in the U.S. and the effects on local climate, and then kind of zooming out longer time period, how has climate been changing during the summer in the U.S. when we actually look at air temperature and land use, and then also these same processes globally. All right, so agricultural land use is very dynamic. Obviously, we have lands going into and out of cultivation all the time. People are changing what crops they're growing, their planting times, etc. In recent years, when we had this big commodity price spike during 2008 to 2012, there was actually quite a bit of cropland expansion. So that really dominated. And this is some work done by my colleagues at University of Wisconsin based on the USDA cropland data layer, which is a high resolution remote sensing product. And during the short time period, there was a net expansion into cropland of about 3 million acres, which is about the size of Connecticut, which is considerable for not that many years. And this provides us with a really nice case study because the cropland data layer tells us what the vegetation type was before and what it's gone into. And then we get an idea about how the crops themselves are influencing the climate in these areas. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking in the Texas Panhandle, this little area there. It's obviously a fairly dry place. The crops tend to be irrigated. So it was our test subject to see if this approach would yield some results. And what I'm showing here is the vegetation index. So this is an indication of the greenness of the landscape. And so these particular areas went from grass into maize, irrigated maize. And so you can see the seasonal cycle of the grass growing, and then after conversion, the peak is just dramatically higher with the managed row crop. Now, if we go back then to some of these other biophysical variables that we care about, like the albedo, the evapotranspiration, and the land surface temperature, we can see how those are changing as well. The albedo during the winter tends to increase, but during the summer, it's a relatively minor change. The peak evapotranspiration during the summer goes up dramatically, and the land surface temperature has dropped around 5 degrees Celsius or around 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So this this sort of analysis can then be expanded to look at spatial variation and seasonal variation, and we're starting to look at different crop types, different types of transitions. This is showing the average change in the vegetation index from areas that went from grass to maize and soybeans. And I'm using data from, these are data from MODIS, a remote sensing product. And I've taken all those areas and just binned them into half-degree grid cells. So we haven't just changed, the eastern Dakotas into maize and soybeans. Obviously, a lot of that land has been converted, but it's where we have also had a lot of changes recently. So we can really see the effects there. And there are some interesting seasonal patterns that pop out. So the EVI goes down on the shoulder seasons and is increased during the peak of the growing season. Moving to some of these other variables, we lose a few grid cells because these products are slightly larger, so it's harder to reach the conversion threshold that I'm specifying, but the evapotranspiration tends to go down in the shoulder seasons and up during the peak of the growing season. And then likewise with temperatures. So actually increases in temperatures on the shoulder season and a suppression of temperatures of around up to around 5 degrees Celsius during July. So this idea that that cropland expansion can lead to a cooling of the landscape is actually something that has been explored in the past in climate model simulations. And it was something of interest for me looking back at the climate history of the US using observational data. So I was really interested in how extreme temperatures were changing specifically. And to give you an example of how I'm doing that, take a look at weather stations. And obviously you could fit a trend through this cloud of points for just the average, how the average is changing. But if we want to know how this is changing distributionally, a nice tool is quantile regression, which allows us to fit the 95th percentile, the 50th, and the 5th percentile. And you can see for this weather station in Iowa, there's a cooling that's particularly strong in the 95th percentile. Going out more broadly to looking at weather stations all across the US, we can see that this cooling pattern is sort of concentrated over the Corn Belt. And this particular analysis is done for 1910 to 2014, but I've removed the Dust Bowl years and also the years of maximum aerosol-induced forcing. So it's suggestive that there's some other background influence on temperatures that's not just, that extreme heat event and then a suppression from aerosols. So the cropland expansion theory came in here. Well, what if this is due to cropland expansion? You can go back and look at Census of Agriculture data to try and evaluate that, and fit trends to cropland area. And what we see is that there are some places in the US where cropland area has increased kind of in the western corn belt, but over in the east, we've had really a loss of cropland over this time period, this long 100-year time span. So if we look at the associations between crop area trend and the 95th percentile maximum temperatures, there's not a strong relationship. You can think of this plot as basically just a binned scatter plot. So take all those weather stations, they're associated with their local land use change. And then those are grouped according to just categories or how much the cropland area has changed locally. Okay, so in a few cases, it seems like there are significantly different trends from zero, but there's no real strong relationship here with the crop area trend. Now, there were much greater rates of land conversion in the late 1800s, so the direct effect of land conversion is probably more strongly observed then. We looked at other variables like precipitation and irrigation. Irrigation, obviously supplementing soil moisture, increases evapotranspiration, and that is important for certain areas of the Great Plains, Arkansas, Central Valley, but it doesn't explain the broad pattern over the central U.S. So jump straight to our conclusion here was that, in fact, it's not just the category of land use, but it's the intensity of land use. And specifically, if you think about croplands from 1910, slightly different than croplands today in terms of how productive they are, the leaf area index, the nitrogen status, presumably rooting depth, and the length of their growing season. And so we can back out from the USDA survey data of 12 summer crop types, back out a net primary productivity based indicator, and fit trends to that. And what we can see is that those areas where cropping has intensified tend to have decreasing extreme temperature trends. So this indicates that these more productive landscapes, they have greater potential for evapotranspiration. You get hot days, and that's when this cooling potential is really manifested to help suppress temperatures. Okay, and cooling is only sustained when soil moisture is sufficient for rain-fed areas. So if we go over here, these are the trends fit to irrigated weather stations for non-drought conditions and drought conditions. So obviously when you have a lot of irrigation going on, you're artificially supplementing soil moisture in the area. The fact that it's droughty doesn't affect the local area quite as much. But when you do the same analysis in predominantly rain-fed landscapes, that's where you see a big divergence. So, as long as there's moisture, these areas have seen trends similar to the irrigated areas, but it's really that cooling is removed during drought. And so as a result of this kind of suppression of temperatures from evapotranspiration, now when we get a big drought event like 2012, it's a much bigger departure from what has been seen in the past. So we have the suppression is removed and the temperatures seem quite amplified relative to the surrounding years. Okay, so global scale, obviously the US Midwest is somewhat anomalous in its productivity and extent, and the fact that it's predominantly summer crops. So it was an open question as to whether this effect could be seen in other locations around the globe. So we looked at, there were 5 locations where we thought this effect might manifest. So US, Canadian prairies, in East Asia, kind of a northern and southern region, and in Argentina. And these two were kind of our null regions because winter cropping is very predominant in those areas, so we would not affect any changes in, or not expect any changes in productivity to influence summer temperatures. Okay, and so across these different areas, I'll spare you the details, but it does seem like there is a consistent suppression of temperatures over these most intensified areas, essentially because of the water use by the crop. But I should point out this is really just for those most extreme temperatures where this effect seems to manifest most strongly. So if you look at, say, mean temperature trends, it's not very obvious. All right, so just to wrap up these 3 studies before I get into the pest speculation, so with recent land cover change in the Great Plains, we have cooler land surface temperature during the midsummer and warmer on the shoulder seasons. But if we look at air temperature trends over a much longer period, 100-year trends, it actually seems to be the intensity of the cropping and the productivity that's influencing air temperature most strongly through changes in evapotranspiration, not cropland expansion, and that those are seen consistently in other regions around the globe. All right, so why do I think this is particularly relevant for our conversation today? Well, I think one strong take-home point is just that land use strongly influences the climatic conditions that pests are going to experience. And as land use changes, that can have seasonal changes and also distributional effects as well. So it might affect drought conditions or extreme temperatures more than averages or minimums. And I think there are some really interesting potential for feedbacks between pest infestations, crop and forest productivity, and temperatures. Give you an idea of what I'm thinking about. You know, let's say you have a pest infestation, you get a reduction in vegetation productivity. You might have reduced evapotranspiration, higher temperatures, maybe lower humidity. Depending on the temperature, that could then negatively affect the crop if it was quite extreme. And I'm hoping some of the people in this room can provide some information on this linkage. You know, then how does that local effect then feed back to affect the conditions that the pests are living in? Now, I'm not aware of a whole lot of work tracing out all these different pathways in an agricultural setting, but I wanted to highlight one paper that we might actually be hearing more about tomorrow. I see one of the co-authors is in the room, looking at bark beetle mortality in the western US and showing how some of these same processes play out with reductions in evapotranspiration, with tree mortality, and increases in land surface temperature. So with that, I'll say thanks and take any questions.
Thanks, Nathan. So great, I appreciate that. I think that was a nice, type of a bridge that was indicated previously. And I just have 2 reminders for you who are answering or asking questions. Please, this is for our online audience. Please state who you are and also use the microphone so people can hear you. And we did have one question from an online participant, and they want to know what parameters determine EVI?
EVI, you can just think of it broadly as an indication of the greenness of the landscape and is reflective of the chlorophyll content. So it uses differences in wavelengths, or different wavelengths from remote sensing to calculate that index.
Great. Anyone? We have a question here.
So,
Chonggang.
And Nathan, I think I have a question about, because you point out that the cropland can do the coolings for the land surface in a way. So, but when coupling together with the atmosphere, the atmosphere and the atmosphere component together, what would be net impact on the climate of the cropland?
The net impact on Yeah, you mean sort of like on global mean temperatures?
Because normally like people like in tropical forest, when they convert the forest to cropland, normally treat that as a carbon source to the climate, right? So that causes global warming actually. So in your case, seems like on the surface side we see the coolings, and I try to see your points on what's the total net impact. Probably it's different from tropicals to temperate also, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so I think when you're thinking about the total climate impact of a particular ecosystem, whether it be managed or unmanaged, you have to consider both the biogeochemical forcing and the local biophysical influence. There have been some efforts to sort of integrate those two and put them on a common metric. There was a paper in Nature Climate Change a couple of years ago on that. But yeah, so for the case of croplands, I mean, on the one hand, they can have this cooling effect during the peak of the summer season, but then you think about might be warming on the shoulder seasons, and you're using there's not a lot of carbon storage going on in that landscape, and you might be losing carbon from the soil. You're also probably using a lot of nitrogen fertilizer if it's highly managed, and that releases nitrous oxide. So yeah, I would say it's difficult to say.
So
yeah,
I think
but probably less than a natural ecosystem. Yeah.
But also you're thinking about, because we have higher transpiration that indicate more water vapors in the air, right? And all clouds formations, and I think that's like a regional climate models may be helpful to help us understand, like a wolf type of model that can be useful.
Yes, actually that's one of the directions we're heading, is to use WRF coupled with CLM that has a crop model integrated to actually simulate the effects of this. And usually when climate, kind of on the climate modeling side, people have considered irrigation changes quite a bit, but less so in terms of the actual productivity of the crops. And so I think there's more to come on that. I know there are people working on how that's affected precipitation changes as well, and suggesting that some of the increase in precipitation during the summer across the eastern U.S. can in part be attributed to that moisture recycling effect. Yeah.
Jeff Dukes.
So I've got a question that's sort of on the other end of this spatial and temporal scale from Chonggang's, which is, I'm interested, you've got this picture up here, we have the row crop agriculture right next to a forest, and you're talking about how the row crop agriculture is affecting the climate right there, but how far does, and this may be hard to answer exactly, but sort of how far into the neighboring forest that has not been altered do those effects on the climate go? So to what extent are those effects confined just to the area where the agriculture is? To what extent do they bleed over into the neighboring landscape? Because if we're thinking about weeds and pests, the individual organism may or may not be sitting there in the middle of the row crop agriculture field, right? So I know it's kind of it's sort of, it depends, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I would say it depends. It's unsatisfactory, but I will say for these particular analyses, we're associating weather stations with local changes, and they're usually sort of like half-degree grid cells or county level shifts, and so we haven't done any sort of fancy like spatial averaging to see the optimal correlation when we pull that out, but it could reveal something about that distance. I know there have been some older studies just looking at like dry air coming across an irrigated field, and how long does it take to change the temperatures. But I think in general it depends. Yeah.
Lou Ziska.
Thank you for your presentation. One quick comment. In addition to the intensification that you're referring to There's also a change in terms of planting density for corn. For example, corn is now planted at twice the density that it was back in the 1990s, and that has a significant change in terms of ET. I'm assuming you accounted for that. A larger issue, though, that I'm curious about is the effect of rising CO2 levels per se in terms of stomatal aperture and overall transpirational cooling. Has that been looked at? And in particular, when you see that, potentially you could have increases in canopy temperature as a result of increased stomatal closure in response to CO2. And canopy temperature in terms of insect fecundity and other pests has been fairly well characterized. Have you done that, or are you planning to do that anytime soon?
Yeah, so planting density and then CO2. So yeah, planting density enters in to this analysis because all of the factors that change yield are reflected in our NPP metric. And there have been, I haven't seen a ton of field studies that have done sort of, say, crop evapotranspiration coefficients and planting density, but I have seen a couple, and they do indicate that the planting density, as would be expected, has an impact on evapotranspiration. Yeah, as far as the CO2 effect, I think I would just say the changes in evapotranspiration characteristics from intensification appear to have dominated historically, but obviously that CO2 water use efficiency effect is slowly ramping up. And so I think to actually disentangle how that might play out in the future, I think we would need to do this sort of regional climate simulation where we could actually simulate that effect. Yeah.
Good. One more question, anyone? I'm not, so Andy, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so Andy Knapp. Question I have is, as we see grower practices change, and so you mentioned warming in the shoulder seasons, one of the things that we start to see now is an increased interest in cover cropping, or where we're going to have cover in those off seasons. You think that's enough to offset that warming that you see in those shoulder seasons if we have a crop on the ground at that point in time?
I think it potentially could, yeah. And actually, if you know of any good sources of data on cover crop adoption, please let me know, because I'm very interested in extending this remote sensing analysis to cover crop areas. And even if there's some fractional adoption, maybe we could constrain some of those effects on the shoulder season. But yeah, I think it would potentially have a big effect, and given the push for cover crop adoption, I think it's important to understand the climatic effects of that, because they could be substantial. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point. The Midwest Cover Crop Council is one group that you might want to look to, and some other folks that's obviously an area that's really being addressed rather intensively. So I guess thank you, Nathan, for your presentation. And I would remind folks that if your question didn't get answered, keep it. There could be an opportunity at another time. So just keep that in mind. Next, we're going to hear from Matt Ayres from he's going to talk to us about his work at Dartmouth and some of the things that he's been doing. So Matt, take it away when your presentation is ready.
Thank you. It's such a privilege to be here with you guys. I'm really looking forward to this, and the first presentations and conversation have been just like what I was imagining. And greetings to those of you who are watching online. Oops. So the first national climate assessment was only 15 years ago or so. It included some simple qualitative predictions, some quantitative predictions. The short life cycles, high mobility, reproductive potential, and physiological sensitivity to temperature suggests that even modest climate change will possibly have rapid effects on the distribution and abundance of many insects and pathogens. Note the possibly and the qualifiers. we were even then able to offer some more quantitative predictions, like an increase of 3 degrees C in the coldest night of the winter would permit an expansion of about 180 kilometers in one of the prominent North American tree killers, the southern pine beetle. It turns out when this was revisited 15 years later, now we're saying these predictions have been upheld, and many of these things are happening even faster than we imagined, including clear examples, in particular from dendroctonous bark beetles. And actually, the quantitative predictions that have been developed for these insects have actually been surprisingly congruent. The biggest surprise has been how fast some of the atmospheric changes have been, including in the coldest night of the winter, which happens to be very important. So changes in pestilence challenge environmental security. And this is really an old story. They will devour what little you have left, including every tree that is still growing in your fields. And the hypothesis that climate or weather can influence insect pests is one of the oldest hypotheses in biology. This paper from 1665 in a journal that still exists today invokes warm, dry summers as a causal agent for locust outbreaks in the Ukraine. So what are some strategic responses to these changes and these challenges to environmental security? And I think this is part of our job in the next couple days. I have a couple suggestions. One of them is improve pest monitoring, prediction, and mitigation. We can actually do this. There are some pretty good models for this. We need to do it more and better. Increased sharing of knowledge among regions, countries, and continents. There are so many cases of old pests in new places. Many of those where there's considerable expertise about the biology and management for those pests, but it's everywhere. Whoops. And so sharing of knowledge becomes crucial so that every place doesn't have to start over, learning everything by trial and error. Improved biosecurity against future invasions. Many of the most consequential pests are the result of inadvertent intercontinental transport of insects that become pests, and once they become established, like emerald ash borer here in North America, frequently all we can do is watch. Management plans that anticipate continuing change, including new pests. We should just expect this. It's happening all over the world. It's going to continue to happen. Growth of practical theory that is transportable among forests and regions. This is a pathway towards shortcuts, towards management responses that make sense. I'm fond of saying that there's nothing more practical than good theory. I'm especially fond of saying this to my many good colleagues who I respect, but who think that theory is a luxury or perhaps a distraction when we're trying to solve some particular pest problem right now. So I'm going to offer you a few of my favorite practical theories. One of them is that temperature affects insect survival, like these data for southern pine beetles. Probability of death by freezing is a function of the minimum experienced temperature. Warmer temperatures increase metabolic rate, and hence consumption, growth, development rates, movements, and dispersal. This generalized relationship here, this applies to more or less every life form on planet Earth other than us birds and mammals that happen to be warm-blooded. It increases more than linearly, about doubles with every 2 degrees C. This is one of the best known features of life on Earth. Temperature affects phenology and species interactions, like these Arctic mosquitoes who have an aquatic beetle predator. When it gets warmer, the predator eats more of them per day, but the mosquitoes also develop faster. Turns out that the increase in mosquito development is actually more than the increase in consumption rate of the predator, so the mosquitoes end up coming ahead in that case. Another theory, this might be my favorite one of all. Pestilence, begins, is a function of abundance. So the things that we think of as pests, the things that challenge our environmental security, tend to do so when there become lots and lots of them. So in population ecology, we can abstract this to big N, capital N. And abundance next year is equal to abundance this year times the magic little e raised to R, where R is per capita growth rate, which is births minus deaths plus immigration minus emigration. Again, this is a property of biological organisms that would be true, is true on this planet and would be on any other too. Very, very general. It goes deeper. There are sequences of graduate level courses on really nothing more than here. The R itself has a couple of elements to it. It's a function of current and previous abundance, as well as exogenous effects or density-dependent effects. The well-known tendency for many defoliating pests to cycle in their abundance and their defoliations is a result of delayed negative feedbacks from natural enemies that take a year or two to catch up and linger a year or two later. The features of population outbreaks can be understood in terms of those models. Here's another one for you in the same category. Positive feedback destabilizes population dynamics. So part of the reason that dendroctonous bark beetles are pests is because they kill trees and reproduce by attacking trees en masse and overwhelming the defenses of the trees. So when there are more beetles, they succeed better, which makes them reproduce better, which means there are more beetles. And it's a positive feedback. And so many of these populations have the property of being bipolar in their abundance, either real rare or very abundant when they get into this range where the positive feedback can kick them up to a whole nother level of abundance. Many herbivores have hosts beyond their current range. So when you have pre-existing hosts, newly suitable climate, short generation time, high reproductive potential, rapid dispersal, we should expect, and we're seeing, frequent rapid range expansion of things that eat plants. Invasions and range expansions increase the risks of pestilence. They don't all, by any means, become pests, but enemy release, sometimes they leave their predators behind. Sometimes they encounter trees and forests that are susceptible to them, and not uncommonly they encounter pest managers who don't know anything about them and lack the capacity to manage them. Another one for you, phylogenetic conservatism of pestilence, I call this. So species that are related tend to share many features by virtue of common descent, like phenology and life history, hosts and feeding mode, enemies and symbionts. Those things yield similar population dynamics and similar tendencies or not to sometimes become so abundant that they become a pest. And so new pestilence tends to involve familiar pests. So this list of 12 or 15 insect genera here, these things pop up all over the world. The next pest isn't going to be a random species. It's going to come from a small, recognizable, non-random set of species, probably. Okay, so a big one. Globalization and climate and changes in land use both reinforce each other. Globalization and changes in land use promote invasions and range expansions. Invasions sometimes produce changes in land use. Changes in climate can influence invasions and facilitate range expansions as well. So there's a feedback system at a big scale. I've worked on southern pine beetle, Dendroctonus frontalis, for a lot of my career. I'll give you a few examples from what I know about this system. This is a stand of pines in East Texas. This is what we call a spot because of how they appear from an airplane to an observer. During an epidemic in just the area of East Texas, say, or central Louisiana, there may be 10,000 such spots. These are all trees that were killed within a couple of months. The trees weren't sick. These are just really aggressive beetles. So they've always been one of the most important features in the ecology of southern pine forests for tens of millions of years, I guess. Recently, in the 2000s, southern pine beetle became detected in the southern pine lands of New Jersey, expanded through into New Jersey, and is now throughout New Jersey and beyond. When they were first detected down here, the forest managers had to send specimens off to people and say, have you ever seen anything like this? What's going on? And they said, yes, congratulations, you're a member of the Southern Pine Beetle Club. So this is an aerial view in New Jersey of pines that were killed in over just a few weeks' time by southern pine beetle, similar place from the ground. It's really an impressive thing to say. Forests changed to non-forests in a matter of weeks. This, without the pattern represented here, this wouldn't be happening. So this range expansion is very clearly linked to warming of winter temperatures, in particular the coldest night of the winter, which is what determines whether or not the beetles survive the winter. So here's 50 years, northern pine lands, southern pine lands, of the coldest night of the winter, and this red band here represents the zone where southern pine beetles begin dying from the cold. So maybe half of them die here, 90% of them die here. Over 50 years, the coldest night of the winter has warmed by over 4 degrees C. And whereas it was frequently common, every few winters it would get cold enough so that any southern pine beetles that had found their way there would die and we wouldn't notice, to there being many years where that doesn't happen anymore. At the same time, the average annual temperatures have barely changed at these same NOAA climate stations. So some of you might remember this story, front page, New York Times. Insect experts see a chance to kill off invasive species as a result of the global vortex. I did not make the cut to get asked for comments on this article, or I would have suggested that this seemed a bit irrationally exuberant. But after that, the New Jersey Forest Service contacted me and said, well, what do you think about this? And I said, well, we have an app for that. So first of all, here's the weather, the coldest night of the winter in that year. Isn't this amazing? This is front page news in the New York Times now. 15 years ago, it would have been just another winter day. So this is our app. We don't have this configured for your phone yet, but you could just stick it in your pocket. So this is estimated proportion of beetles to die from freezing as a function of air temperature on the coldest night. So on that night in New Jersey, depending upon where you were, we would have expected 40 to 75% mortality or so. which can be helpful. Good time to implement more aggressive management because you may be able to push them back down below that escape threshold. In fact, these are data from the New Jersey Forest Service. Abundance in 2013, abundance in 2014. It in fact went down by about half between those 2 years. Just about that time, southern pine beetles were discovered on Long Island, where it turns out there is 100,000 acres or more of beautiful pine forest, an iconic ecosystem type in North America. And so Long Island is getting chewed up right now. A few more years like we've had the last couple, and there aren't going to be very many pine trees left on Long Island. This is all new to the forest managers in New York and elsewhere. They've done an amazing job of deploying themselves already. The spring following detection, they're able to put out pheromone traps and sample them, not just on Long Island, but also here. And those red circles indicate positive captures of southern pine beetles. I live right about here. I used to drive like 4 days to Louisiana to study southern pine beetles. Now they've been detected 90 minutes south of my house. So why is the southern pine beetle not so southern anymore? Well, the coldest winter of the night is not as cold as it used to be. That's definitely part of it. What about naive forests? So Carissa has been studying the defenses of pitch pine, which previously we had no experience in knowing what they would be like as hosts for southern pine beetle. In terms of their resin defenses, they're not as well defended as the southern pines, but much more so than, say, white pine or red pine that occur to the north. Carissa has also been working to test and extend risk rating models and our understanding of what makes high risk stands from the southeastern U.S. to see if that also applies in the New Jersey pine lands, and indeed it does pretty well. So high risk stands are those with high percentage of pine, high stem density, smaller DBH, high basal area, small crowns. This follows pretty well from experience there. One consequence of this is that this is the range in the northern pine lands that they're reaching in numbers now, and this is filled with stands that are just like those high-risk stands in the figure below. So we can anticipate a smokeless wildfire of southern pine beetles in the northern pine lands. How about naive forest managers? I mean no disrespect. I'm working with these people. They're doing an amazing job in New York and Connecticut, Massachusetts. But you know, do they know everything that they need to, or are they at a disadvantage? Well, there are definitely some disadvantages. I can begin with a map of the jurisdictional regions of the U.S. Forest Service. The expertise for southern pine beetle is in Region 8. Now they're in Region 9, and it's astonishingly difficult for Forest Service scientists or managers to move back and forth across that line. Everybody thinks that's ridiculous, but nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. So that's a barrier to the exchange of information. Naive management. I got this email from Kerry. New York State had to say, well, is this an invasive or is this a range expansion? Because it turns out by New York State law that influences who has jurisdiction and responsibility. This is a story in a Montreal newspaper making fun of Long Island because apparently there was a pickup truck with 4 guys from Canada with chainsaws who had to go to Long Island to cut down trees because nobody on Long Island has a chainsaw. Well, that's not quite true, but it's not far off. So there's certainly no mills, there's no logging trucks, there's no capacity for cutting down trees, much less doing anything with them. And so this is a challenge for them. Attempted suppression on Long Island. This particular effort, it seemed like it worked fairly well on a local scale, but Actually, based on how we understand that this cut and leave suppression technique works in the southeast, it shouldn't have worked given that it was done during the winter. So there's new challenges for the managers there. And these poor pitch pine forests, they have gypsy moths. These are fire-maintained ecosystems, but fires are problematic. And now there's the damn southern pine beetle. And so most of these vectors are shifting the forest towards oak and away from pine. So is climate change reducing southern pine beetle impacts in the south? That is a clear pattern in the empirical data. They have become such a non-issue for forest managers in the southeast that the southern Region 8 is, paring down its southern pine beetle management and research. Is that because it's getting too warm there? So maybe, one possibility is that's consistent with the idea of a climatic envelope where, if it moves north at the north end, the distribution also moves north at the south end. But there's a competing idea that some know as the tyranny of thermodynamics, which just says if you're an insect, warmer's better. And so don't necessarily expect that you're gonna see that. So Jeff Lombardo has been studying this, including measuring upper lethal temperatures and studying climate patterns. So warm spells are more complicated than the coldest night of the winter because a hot spell has a duration as well as a maximum, and that matters to the physiological effect. So organisms don't die in an instant like they do from cold, and so we have to take into account. And so Jeff has been making graphs and analyses like this of hot spells where here's the duration, here's the intensity of the hot spells, and so if you draw slices through that thing, you can say, well, 90%, 50%, and then you can look at it in this way, which is a little easier for a brain like mine. So 50% chance of 5 days when it gets to at least 37. 50% chance of at least 15 days in a row when it gets to over 34, et cetera. So Jeff was able to analyze, well, what's been the pattern in that? And this is the most dramatic one that he found in analyses of 5 or 6 regions, and it's trivial. In terms of our beetles. Little bit of increase here, but actually none of these temperatures are cold enough to kill southern pine beetles, and it really isn't getting hotter there. And so it's not from warming summers, but actually I think this is one of the biggest success stories in the history of forest pest management. This is from good management, detection, suppression, a combination of programs which have dramatically changed the landscape. Okay, so tactics for environmental security in the Anthropocene. I'm going to put in a plea for what we can call adaptive management in the sense of Holling and the Resilience Alliance, et cetera. And so this is so beautiful. So there's a management challenge like an insect outbreak, and managers are going to do something or nothing, which is another way of doing something. Science tells us, well, what are the possibilities, what's the certainty and uncertainty associated with those. Based on that, we decide on a response, and we study what the system actually does after we do whatever we did, compare the system response to our theoretical models so the science gets better. Next time the management can be better. It's so beautiful. We must do that all the time, right? But we don't. It's very hard to find any examples of this in any area that I know. And I'd like to pose that as a question for all of us. Here's a winner. This is management of mallards. So in 1996, all the biologists got together, and of course there were differences of opinion about what influences mallard dynamics. which of course influences Fish and Wildlife setting bag limits on how many mallards people are going to shoot this year. And so they said, well, we all think we're equally right, so let's just start out saying that there's a 25% chance of all of those being correct. And then every year they did whatever they did for the management, but they compared the system response to the a priori agreed upon logical predictions from the different theoretical models. And after a few years, that diverged into two sets of models. Now this model is emerging as clearly better than the others. Workers in this area are now splitting this up into finer possibilities. Doesn't that look like progress? Why don't we do that all the time? You tell me, please. So my second and remaining tactic for environmental security is transdisciplinary study of coupled human-natural systems, how to do it faster and better. So many of the important problems now lie at the nexus of traditional disciplines. No one of us has the tools or capability to do it by ourselves. So here's just a couple of examples. One of them is how to slow the flood of human-aided biological invasions. Gary Lovett, others, this paper just published suggests that, well, what we really need are new laws. The science is there, but lawmakers have to step up and do something, and then there are some sensible things that could be done that is going to keep the next emerald ash borer from coming to the U.S. Lots of challenges in the valuation of forests and forest pestilence. Good progress in some areas, other areas where there's still a lot of unknowns. Social perceptions of forestry and forest science. One of the challenges that we've had in New Jersey and now Long Island is convincing people that the way to manage for southern pine beetle is to find the trees that have southern pine beetles in them, which are highly aggregated, and cut those trees down and take them away. Some people think, we know, you guys, that's just another trick for you to cut down trees. And it doesn't make sense to us that cutting down trees is good for the forest. You can sort of see where they're coming from on that, but they just need to hear a little bit more because this tactic actually does work, and without it, you lose the forest for saving the trees. Profitable forest products industry in a changing economy. More and more, I'm impressed by the extent to which in the absence of a profitable forest products economy, we can't do the management that's needed to have the kinds of forests that provide the kinds of services that we expect. This is so evident in New Jersey and Long Island, where New Jersey shut down their management program because they can't pay for it. In the South, it gets paid for by salvage loggers who buy the logs, take them to a mill, sell them. They're able to make a little bit of money on it. And the management gets done. In the absence of being able to make a few bucks on cutting down a pine tree, it's prohibitively expensive to do the management that we know is effective and can work. So we're not going to start putting pulp mills on Long Island, but no, how about turning them into birdhouses and selling them in Manhattan? Buy a birdhouse, save a forest. I mean, there's 50 million people who live around there. There has to be some possibilities. But this is a challenge. And my last one, so this is a eucalyptus stand in South Africa. Here's a couple of entomologists for scale. These trees were 4 years, 4 months old when I took that picture. They're also all one clone, and so this allows incredible increased efficiency in the mills. So there are enormous pulp mills that are designed for optimally processing a single genotype of one species of tree. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that this is a big part of the reason why the pulp industry in North America is on the edge. Pulp mills are shutting down all over the Southeast, which is taking away the capacity for managing southern pine beetles, for example. Same thing is true in Canada. There's a lot of forests that depend on there being a little bit of money in the pulp industry. I don't know whose job it is to think about, what happens and how to mitigate the risks of this. It certainly feels like it's outside my zone of expertise, but I hope somebody's working on this. The things that we're talking about at this meeting have never been more important and interesting. I think there are many challenges. Welcome to the Anthropocene. I look forward to seeing our progress over the next couple days. Thanks. That's all I have.
Great, thank you, Matt. That's really some good information. And so I would open it up. Is there some questions that anyone would want to ask Matt here while we've got some time? Yep. Chung Gang.
Hi, Matt. It's a very interesting presentation looking at New Jersey southern pine beetles, and you point out that the New York Times indicating that the same temperature as before, but that's a big news in a way. So I'm wondering, like, normally when temperature get warmer, the insect used to the warmer climate, actually they may build less anti-freezing compound. They can be less tolerant to the same temperature as before. Is that going to happen in the southern pine beetle, basically?
So there are some cases of that in insects where there is adaptive plasticity in the amount of antifreeze, and so if it's warm, and then it gets a little bit cold, they might die. But lots of them are also fairly fixed during the winter months, and that's the case with southern pine beetles. There are some differences among life stages. But we've looked at it in various ways, and we have not seen any of those short-term adjustments. Mountain pine beetle, I think, do have some of those.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, Steve.
So, Matt, for the northern expansion of these pine beetles, say New Jersey, I think you said they were detected in 2002. Is there any evidence that before these rural forests were invaded, that 3 years or 5 years or a decade before that, you had small populations in urban trees where the winter temperatures don't get so cold, and that this allowed populations to sort of build up until the climate caught up with, so that pests could hopscotch?
Yeah, very interesting question. I don't know. Nobody was looking, of course. They seem to be fairly adept at expanding on their own. I'm not troubled by the model in which it's expansions and then they get whacked by a cold winter and they go back, and that they're always kind of pushing that. So I'm pretty sure that they were not harbored on Long Island prior to their recent detection. That would be real surprising. So I'm pretty sure it's a real expansion. At least tree killing wasn't happening before. We would have seen that.
So Matt, I had a question. From what you've seen and what you've described with this, the insect has moved from the south now up to New Jersey and Long Island, and then you talked about, the expertise is in the south, and you've had trouble getting it to this new area. Have you looked at other systems or situations where this same scenario has happened, or similar likelihood to say, this is what was done there, or this was the outcome, or is this like something new that's never been seen before in other systems?
I think it's pretty easy to find other parallels. We can turn around emerald ash borer. The expertise and knowledge for emerald ash borer is in the north, and now emerald ash borer has extended across that same boundary. And they're experiencing the same problems. It's hard for them to go to the same meetings because of bureaucratic rules. Europe, there's maybe across country lines there, somewhat different mechanisms that make it harder. But every place there's a case of changing distributions. Sami reindeer herders in Scandinavia. There's a defoliating Lepidoptera that's expanding its distribution. The Sami reindeer herders in this area have thousands of years of traditional knowledge of how these animals influence the movements of reindeer. Now it's moving into areas where the practices and traditions are different because they don't have that experience.
Yeah, that's really key. We have a question from our online audience. Says, which temperature envelope concept do you think is more realistic, the moving circle or the lower latitude, wider latitude?
There are very clear cases of both of those being true. And so we need more studies on this. There haven't been enough studies of populations at the warm edge of their distributions. Research has tended to be concentrated at the cool edge. And so, but the data that are available from some lizards and some insects and a few things indicates a mix. So it can definitely go both ways.
We have time for one more question. Anyone just anxious to ask? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
This is Barbara Benz. It's kind of more of a comment, perhaps, than a question. So with insect expansion northward, I think it would be helpful for us as a group to sort of maybe partition that into how we're seeing things change relative to our recorded history. So we know in the past 100 years, nobody's seen southern pine beetle in New Jersey, correct? Same with mountain pine beetle. In the past 100 years, nobody had seen it as far north as it is in Alberta and British Columbia. But I think it would help if we thought, so we could think about it in that, because it does have an influence on how managers, what they know about, and cultural kinds of, traditions and stuff. But I think it would help us to go beyond that as well, which is a much harder thing to do, to think about, okay, well, maybe 10,000 years ago they actually were there, and how by having that knowledge of maybe how tree species could have adapted with the insects or not, or plant species, I think that might help in our thinking about current management as well.
I agree with all of that completely. Southern pine beetles had been previously detected in like 1920s in New Jersey. I'm positive that this isn't the first time that pitch pine and southern pine beetle have been interacting in a very strong way in the longer history of evolutionary time. I have no doubt about that at all. That's part of the reason why intercontinental invasions, I think, are particularly scary, is because there's a greater chance of encountering a new insect if it gets off a boat from Asia or Europe, of encountering a whole clade of plants in North America that really have no evolutionary history with it, and that's exactly what's happening with ash, or poor fraxinus, or toast. And there's nothing that we can do about it. I agree with that. And it's a continuum. Range expansions are, there's maps make it seem misleadingly simple. Edges of distributions have been going like this for 100 years while we watch, and over tens of thousands of years. Of course, they've been sweeping back and forth across a much larger area. Thank you, Barbara, for that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So it's 10 after, or about 15 after. Why don't we take a break, and let's meet back at 3:30. So everyone go ahead and break, and we'll reconvene here in a bit.